Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission here is to take the deepest, most complex source material, the stuff you should read but maybe don't have time for, and distill it into pure, actionable knowledge. Today, we are strapping on our boots and joining one of the greatest scientific minds of the last century, Edward O. Wilson, on an incredible journey.
It really is. It's a journey of physical adventure, but also um, profound scientific introspection.
We're diving into chapter 4 of his incredible work, Biophilia. It's called The Bird of Paradise. And the second question we have for you is this. How does a scientist truly understand the natural world?
Right.
Without losing that sense of wonder that drew them there in the first place. Wilson argues that science, just like art, has to achieve a kind of synthesis. It has to blend, and I'm quoting here, exact imagery with more distant meaning.
Exactly. And this deep dive, it uses this one, it's dazzling natural example, the male emperor of Germany, Bird of Paradise, to make a massive philosophical point.
Okay.
Wilson's arguing that to really understand life, you need this essential synthesis. You start with reductionism.
Which is just breaking things down.
Yeah, breaking things down into their smallest parts for analysis. The genes, the neurons. But, and this is key, you absolutely must pair that with holism, a humanistic synthesis that rebuilds the whole thing to understand its beauty and its function.
So why does this matter beyond just, biology?
Because if we want to understand human psychology, our ethics, our own evolution, which is the whole point of biophilia, we have to accept that our innate connection to nature isn't just poetic. It's not just emotional. It's physiological.
It's in our genes.
It's in our genes.
Yeah.
And the method he uses to understand this bird is the same method we need to understand ourselves.
Okay, let's unpack this, because before we get to the philosophy, we have to earn it. The chapter opens not in a lab, but on a trail. We join Wilson at age 25. He's a brand new PhD from Harvard, and he's fueled by what he calls these dreams of physical adventure in far-off places with unpronounceable names.
You can just feel the excitement. And this is a time when field biology was really defined by sheer physical effort.
So where are we?
We are immediately transported to the Huon Peninsula of New Guinea. Wilson describes it as this massive weathered horn projecting from the coast, a piece of land about the size of Rhode Island.
And his goal wasn't glamorous.
No, not at all. It was rigorous taxonomy.
Yeah.
He needed to collect a full sample of ants and small animals along a vertical transect, basically from the lowlands all the way up to the highest mountain ridges.
And the key detail here, and I love this, is that this was not a well-trodden path.
No.
Wilson believed he was the first biologist to even attempt this route, so every single specimen was incredibly valuable. It really gives it that frontier adventure feeling.
The trek itself was just difficult, uncertain. It took 3 days of strenuous uphill walking just to reach the end point.
Which was where?
The spine of the Sarawaget Range. We're talking 12,000 feet above sea level. This is high country, above the tree line.
So up there, the environment is completely different. It's a grassland, and it's sprinkled with these fascinating kind of squat plants that Wilson points out, cycads.
Right, cycads. And for anyone who doesn't know, they're gymnosperms, so they're cone-bearing plants, and they look a bit like stunted palm trees.
But their presence there is more than just botany. It's a shock.
It's a historical shockwaves. Wilson points out the evolutionary weight they carry. These forms date back to the Mesozoic era.
You're kidding.
No. He writes that plants very similar to them might have been, and I quote, browsed by dinosaurs 80 million years ago.
So you're standing on a mountain peak in the present day, but you're looking into deep, deep time.
Exactly. So after all this grinding uphill, collecting beetles and frogs, the narrative just pauses. On a chill morning, the clouds lift, the sun breaks through, and Wilson and his Papuan guides, who were hunting alpine wallabies, they all just stop.
A shared moment.
A shared, unsolicited moment of awe. They just stood there together, scanning this huge panoramic view of the Bismarck Sea, the Markham Valley, all the way to the Herzog Mountains.
And that shared pause is so important. It proves that our deepest responses to nature, they transcend culture, they transcend purpose. It's the humanistic moment before the science begins.
Right. A pure moment of appreciation.
Yeah.
But, the scientist's work requires descending and cataloging. So now we go back down through these different bands of vegetation below the crest.
Each one a totally different world.
Totally different. The zone right below the ridge is the cloud forest. It's perpetually wet, dim. He calls it a literal labyrinth.
A labyrinth.
Yeah. The trunks and branches all interlock, and everything is just completely blanketed by this thick, unbroken layer of moss and orchids.
Wow.
He said following the game trails there felt like crawling through a dimly illuminated cave lined with a spongy green carpet.
That's an amazing image. So 1,000 feet lower, things change again.
They do. The temperature rises, the light changes, and we enter the mid-mountain forest. Here the vegetation opens up a bit. The trees are still dense but smaller, and they have these thin, really dramatic buttresses at the base.
And this is where Wilson introduces this sense of the sacred.
He calls it an enchanted world, and it is. It's one of the richest, most nearly pure segments of Papuan flora and fauna. Thousands of species, many found nowhere else on Earth.
And this is where it gets really interesting for his bigger argument, because he sees this place as a window into the past.
A profound, untouched view of life as it existed, quote, before the coming of man thousands of years ago.
It's nature in its purest form.
Yes, the ultimate expression of the natural systems that appeal to our biophilic sense, that innate bond we have with life.
And in this enchanted world, we find the jewel, the centerpiece of his whole argument.
The male emperor of Germany, bird of paradise, Paradisea. Wilson just flat out calls it arguably the most beautiful bird in the world.
So he picks an aesthetic extreme to make his intellectual point.
He does.
So let's break down this bird. Its head is shaped like a crow's, which is sort of a plain detail.
It is, and it reminds you they share that common lineage. But that is where any resemblance ends.
Okay, lay it on me.
The visual details are just astonishing.
Sure.
Its crown and upper breast are metallic oil green. They just shine in the sun. The back is glossy yellow. Wings and tail are a deep reddish maroon.
And the main event.
The main event.
Yeah.
These massive tufts of ivory white plumes that sprout from the flanks and the sides of the breast. And they get all lacy and feathery at the tips.
And if that wasn't enough.
It wasn't. There are these two wire-like plume rectrices, long, thin tail feathers that extend past the body, equaling the bird's full length.
My gosh.
And his bill is blue-gray. His eyes are clear amber. It's an impossible, almost architectural creation.
And it's all designed for one single purpose.
Attraction.
The mating ritual.
During breeding season, the males all gather in what are called leks. These are common courtship arenas, usually high up in the tree branches. And they display these magnificent ornaments to the relatively drab females.
And the display is a full-on performance.
All or nothing. He starts by spreading and vibrating his wings, lifting those gossamer plumes, making these bubbling, flute-like notes.
But the climax is just absurd.
Truly absurd. To show off those pure white flank plumes, the key signal of his health and fitness, he turns completely upside down on the perch.
Upside down.
Pointing those long, wire-like feathers straight up at the sky.
And then?
Then comes the transformation. He fluffs up his green breast feathers, and he opens those white flank plumes until they form a brilliant, glowing white circle completely around his body.
So from a distance?
From a distance, he looks like a spinning, slightly out-of-focus white disc. Just this orb of light in the forest.
That is spectacular. And Wilson uses that image to explain the logic behind the beauty, right? This wasn't some artistic choice.
Not at all. This whole improbable spectacle was driven by millions of generations of intense sexual selection. Male competition and female choice pushed that display to this visual extreme.
Okay, but that's just one trait understood in what he calls physiological time. Now Wilson asks us to pivot completely.
All right, pivot.
We've had the naturalist's awe, we've recorded the display, now the scientist takes over and we shift scale from the visible dance
to the invisible machinery beneath. We have to consider the bird purely as an analytical specimen. Suddenly, this beautiful thing is reduced to a system.
So its developmental program is just code in its chromosomes.
Right. And its ability to do that ridiculous upside-down dance is governed by a completed nervous system. And he says that system, its fiber tracks, are, quote, more complicated than any existing computer.
Wow. And trying to map it would be like trying to survey all the rainforests of New Guinea on foot.
Exactly. So the lab scientists, they alter their perception. They're working at the scale of the micrometer and the millisecond. They're tracing the dance not as poetry, but as a series of commands.
Down to the level of what? Efferent neurons firing?
Efferent neurons,
Yeah.
enzymatic catalysis controlling the feather color, active sodium transport, powering the muscles, all of it.
So Wilson is making a really powerful point here. He's saying the spirit of the scientist who treks up a muddy mountain is the same spirit as the one staring into a microscope.
Yes, the spirit of adventure, of hardship, of triumph, it's fundamentally the same. It's just viewed from a vastly different scale.
What's so smart here is how he uses this reductionist phase to anticipate the criticism he knows is coming.
The humanist critique.
Yeah, that science ruins the magic, that it melts down the Inca gold. By breaking the bird into its parts, they say, the mystery, the art, is lost forever.
And that's a powerful charge. If all that's left is neurons and genes, how do you get the beauty back?
But that's where the second crucial part of the method comes in. Science is not just analytic.
Wilson insists it is also synthetic. It requires, he says, art-like intuition and imagery to take all those separate facts and rebuild the world it just took apart.
Okay, so you use reductionism to find the ultimate truth of the parts, but then synthesis brings you back to the whole animal, only now you know how it works.
Exactly. The initial analysis reduces the behavior to genes and cells. But the synthesis, that's the intellectual triumph. It shows how the activity of those tiny units creates these rich and subtle patterns at the level of the organism.
The dance?
The dance, the social structure, the ecosystem, the outer qualities, the plumes, the shimmering color, they get redefined. They stop being just pretty features. They become holistic properties.
Functional traits.
Functional traits that we now understand are the result of millions of years of selective pressure. And this knowledge, it permanently alters our perception, our emotion. You don't see less beauty. You see beauty magnified by understanding the massive causal chain that created it.
That's a great way to put it. It's like loving a piece of music even more once you understand the math behind it.
Precisely.
So that completes the intellectual cycle. When all that hard-won analytic information is synthesized, reconstituted, as he says, we go back to that familiar view.
The glittering bird through the leaves and mist.
Right, but now we see it with a far greater range of cause and effect. The old illusions of pure mystery, they give way to the light and wisdom of a greater degree.
And that light, it transforms the experience itself. The initial excitement of the scientific search is replaced by what he calls the more enduring responses of the hunter and poet.
That return to the emotional and aesthetic appreciation, deepened by knowledge, that is where the core argument of biophilia really lands.
It is.
So what are those ancient responses that endure after all the science is done? Wilson argues that this whole analytic-synthetic method has to now be turned on to us.
On to the human being itself.
Yeah.
Just like the bird of paradise, we are a composite of myth and mechanism, of poetry and physiology, just waiting for our own examination.
This is the ultimate synthesis.
It is. Wilson says our deepest feelings, our myths, the things that define us, can be penetrated more deeply than ever before. We can trace the physical basis of our emotions in mental development, brain structure, genes.
And connect them all the way back to the evolutionary origins of human nature.
The implication is that we won't fully understand our spiritual or philosophical essence until we accept its physical, biological roots. It's a reciprocal relationship. The more the humanities explore human nature, the more science can add to human biology.
And this integrated approach gives us the tools we need to understand biophilia itself. Why we're drawn to life, why biodiversity matters, why we feel a pull toward those ancient New Guinea forests.
That pull is real, and it's based in our genes and our evolutionary history.
So that was the journey. From the Huon Peninsula trek to the micrometer scale, and then that crucial final step of synthesis that elevates knowledge back to wisdom, enriching both science and the humanities.
You start with physical adventure, you submit to intellectual rigor, and you conclude with an enlightened appreciation.
So here's the provocative thought for you to carry forward. If we accept that the most stunning natural beauty, the impossible dance of the Emperor of Germany, bird of paradise, can be understood both as a poetic spectacle and as a complex machinery of genes and neurons.
What does this integrated analytical synthetic view suggest about the ultimate possibility of tracing the physical basis of our own deepest feelings and myths? And how might knowing that change the way we live,